Okay, so Chelsea Kirk. Hey, Chelsea.
Hello, hey everyone.
Hey, I'm going to introduce you. So Chelsea Kirk is the Assistant Director of Policy and Research at Strategic Actions for a Just Economy for their building, equity, and transit work. Chelsea's research and policy advocacy aims to improve housing quality for tenants in Los Angeles. Much of her recent work focuses on the effort to produce equitable and effective policy responses to the twin crises of housing and climate change. She authored the report, Los Angeles Building Decarbonization, Tenant Impact and Recommendations, which analyzes the impact greenhouse gas reduction policies may have on the renter population of Los Angeles. And I badly wanted to recruit you when I saw you present this similar topic recently. It's like, oh, she knows everything. She's the smartest. This is going to be amazing. So thanks so much for sharing all of your academic and policy thinking with us.
Of course. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here. And so, yeah, I mean, my plan for today is to sort of share some of the challenges of decarbonization for renters, as I am sure you know, and then share some strategies and recommendations to overcome these challenges. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Great. So I'll take questions at the end, and I'll get started. So I'll tell you a little bit about SAGE, the organization I work for. So SAGE is a membership-based tenants' rights organization in South Los Angeles. We do three main things: community organizing, educational outreach, and policy and research. Our policy campaigns are directed at changing laws in the city and county of Los Angeles, and our membership is made up of primarily low-income Latinx tenants. And our members actually help direct our policy work and decide on the policy campaigns that we pursue. So we're very membership-led and community-based. So some context for this presentation and why sort of a tenants' rights org is involved in it. So in December of 2021, the LA City Council did vote to pass a motion to decarbonize all existing buildings in LA City by 2050. This was a huge feat and a big win. And so the current status of this policy is that it's in the design process. The ordinance hasn't yet been signed into law. But an even bigger win was that we were able to get tenants' rights language in the motion. And so we're still pushing and advocating to make sure that actually happens. And so we started doing this work around 2 years ago. This was a new idea for us. We didn't really know much about decarbonization. We hadn't really done any work in climate policy before. But we knew this was going to impact renters because it impacted the buildings they live in. And so the fundamental question, we were asking ourselves and we were trying to answer was, what will decarbonization mean for renters in LA? Are there consequences? If so, what are they? And so we conducted research, we talked to tenants, we did focus groups, we did a survey, we analyzed existing programs and laws. And so I'm going to share, what we found. So first I wanted to start by sharing, what we learned from talking to low-income renters last spring when we had the opportunity to do focus groups for LA City's Climate Emergency Mobilization Office. We talked to 44 low-income renters. And so they shared with us what they saw as the perceived benefits and concerns, which are really important. So they see the greatest benefit is being improving health. So 50% reported that this was the greatest benefit of decarbonization in their view. Second was fighting climate change. Third was, the climate resiliency of the housing that comes from decarbonization efforts, and then improving housing quality. By far, the greatest concern was cost. Tenants were like, who's paying for this? I can't pay for this. How's it going to be paid for? This scares me. I'm rent burdened already. And then eviction and harassment were also concerns we heard in the focus groups. We also learned that 61% of the tenants we talked to reported having unpaid energy bills. 32% reported having rental debt from COVID-19 job loss. 52% reported not having an AC unit in their home. And of those, the 56% reported that it was because they couldn't afford one, was the reason they didn't have one. And then 78% reported having habitability issues in their home, like lead or mold. I just wanted to share two quotes that sort of highlight some of the major themes we were hearing, as well as sort of ground this conversation, which is this first one from Isabel. What concerns me is that the owners will take advantage of this and kick us out. They'll use the excuse of having to construct the apartments to raise our rents. It's really beautiful, all of this, but the cost is concerning. It's going to affect us. And then Betty, if he, the landlord, is going to install an appliance in the house and it's worth $5,000, he's going to want me to pay $2,500, which is not feasible for me. This is what they did here. They installed pipes underneath and each tenant had to pay $500, and there are 30 tenants here. And so in 2021, we also published a report that focused on the implications of a citywide, mandatory decarbonization policy for renters. And we identified, a number of potential consequences that, decarbonization policies must prevent. And this includes greater rent burden for households already struggling, a surge in evictions, both legal and illegal, loss of affordability in rent stabilized units, and corporate consolidation of rental housing. And so these concerns exist, of course, because, decarbonization is a large investment of money and that low-income tenants cannot afford. And under existing laws in Los Angeles, and I'm sure this is true for other cities as well, tenants might actually be responsible for the cost. How much tenants are impacted in LA really depends on whether they're protected by rent stabilization or not. However, even under this policy, up to 100% of the cost can be passed down through cost recovery programs. Tenants who aren't covered by this local rent stabilization law, which is the strongest we have, and who are instead, covered by our California law, which is weaker, can actually be evicted for substantial remodels. So they could be evicted for a retrofit. And then tenants in buildings that are less than 15 years old have no protections at all. And so this is concerning. Most tenants in LA are protected by local rent stabilization. However, as I said, there are exemptions for building upgrades that do allow rent increases. So LA City has 4 cost recovery programs as pictured in the slide. Tenants most likely could see costs for these types of comprehensive retrofits passed through under the primary renovation work program. So under this program, the full cost can be passed on in the form of a 10% rent increase that's amortized over time. Yet it is an increase that remains permanent even after the work is done. And so a 10% increase might not seem like a lot, or this might not seem like a lot, but for a family earning under like $30,000 a year in annual household income, which is a lot of the people we serve at Sage, I assure you it is a lot, and it's going to require either cutting out basic needs, if not leading to an eviction. And LA is not the only city that has these type of exemptions in their rent control policies. Other cities include San Francisco, Oakland, and Los Gatos, and I'm sure many other. It's a common policy and a rent stabilization law. And so I want to talk a bit more about rent stabilization. I keep talking about this law. What is it? What does it do? And what are some of its shortcomings that are related to this topic? So these policies, they cap how much landlords can raise rents, and they limit the reasons tenants can be evicted. In the US, there are probably about 180 municipalities that have some form of a rent stabilization law. And these policies have been really critical at keeping rents low, at curbing displacement, at preserving affordable housing. However, in markets where real estate values are high, they spur all kinds of illegal behavior that typically goes unenforced. And this is because a rent stabilization law is tied to the tenant and not the unit. So when a tenant moves out, rents reset to market rate. And so this, as we've seen, what we see in LA is that this has really created a financial incentive for owners to use illegal mechanisms to displace long-standing tenants who pay below market rate so that they can then replace them with higher earners. So if suddenly a landlord is going to be responsible for paying for a decarbonization retrofit and it costs, thousands and thousands of dollars, they're really going to be motivated to get rid of their tenants who pay below market rate so they can, recover those costs more quickly. And this has led to an enormous number of illegal evictions we already see. We don't know the exact number. It's hard to quantify because of a lack of data, but the general rule of thumb is that for every 1 formal eviction, there are 4 informal evictions. In 2018, for example, as you can see on the slide, there were 41,000 eviction filings in LA. This number dropped during the pandemic, but even last year, the numbers increased again to 40,000, despite the fact that we still have COVID eviction protections in LA. And so this is really concerning. So what do I mean when I say illegal evictions? An illegal eviction is when a landlord uses harassment or other conduct to drive rent-stabilized tenants who are otherwise protected from eviction to move out and abandon their lease. In this process, not only is there more displacement, which could lead to higher rates of homelessness, but there's also a loss of affordability in our rent-stabilized housing stock, because when units turn over, those units rental rates reset to the market rate. As I said, we don't know the exact number of illegal evictions that are occurring, but what we do know is that between 2010 and 2021, there were on average each year around 7,900 calls related to landlord harassment and illegal eviction made to the LA Police Department. And in 2018, the LA Housing Department received 10,000 harassment complaints. I just want to briefly kind of explain what I mean by illegal eviction procedures and what they are and what I'm talking about. So harassment's one that we see commonly, and it can look like many things. We've seen it include a landlord changes the locks on tenants, they're shutting off the utilities on purpose, they're installing security cameras to intimidate the tenant, they're pressuring them to take inadequate buyouts to leave, unprompted visits and forced entry by owners or their agents. And the intent is to make the tenant so uncomfortable that, they leave. Rent evictions is another one that I think is closely related to the conversation around decarbonization, because it's going to require some level of construction work. A rent eviction is what we call when displacement is caused by construction. So there are legal and legal rent evictions. Illegal rent evictions look like when a landlord uses really disruptive construction to drive tenants away and to move out. And so basically the home becomes so uncomfortable due to construction noise, debris over a long period of time with no end in sight, and the tenant just wants to move out for their own physical and psychological health. There are also legal rent evictions. In California, there's an exemption in the statewide eviction protection law that actually allows landlords to evict tenants if there's construction work that'll take more than a month. So it's completely legal. All the tenant really needs, or all the landlord needs to do, is pay their tenant compensation in the amount of 1 month's rent, and the tenant has to move out. And so that's a legal rent eviction. We are also, a big concern also is that, this could lead to the acceleration of the corporate consolidation of LA's rental market. There's a concern that if small landlords are confronted with the high cost of this and they're unable to afford it and there's no funding available to them, they may put their buildings up for sale, kind of creating an opportunity for corporations to acquire their properties. In LA, around 67% of rental housing is owned by corporate investment vehicles. This is corporate ownership really surged after the 2008 financial crisis. And so this is concerning because central to the corporate landlord business model is tenant mistreatment. They really treat rental housing as financial assets. And so, they systematically try to drive low-income tenants out. Not all of them, but we've seen it happen time and again. And research shows, corporate landlords do evict tenants at higher rates. They participate more often in rent and fee gouging than smaller landlords. They're some of the worst code violators in LA County. And importantly, they have the money to defend themselves if they're being held accountable, which they often are never being held accountable for their actions. So those are some of the main, concerns about a citywide, city scale mandated decarbonization policy, like a building energy performance standard, which, the city of LA is in the process of designing. But I also wanted to shift gears a little bit to talk about, obviously that's not the only opportunity for rental housing to be decarbonized. There are a lot of programs that, work to incentivize residents to pursue energy efficiency measures on their own. And I wanted to highlight some of the barriers that hinder the success of these programs in reaching low-income tenants. So in LA, our Los Angeles Department of Water and Power has a lot of programs available for residents to get funding or discounts or technical support to do energy efficiency measures. We have a refrigerator exchange program. This is where low-income residents can get free fridge replacement. The city will come in, give them the fridge, install it, no cost. And we have city plants. City will give free trees to shade the building. We have an AC optimization program, home energy improvement program. We have a cool LA air conditioner rebate program. And there are a lot of options. There are a lot of options for residents. And these programs are great, but they're not reaching low-income renters. And in fact, the agency is actually, paying organizations like Sage to help with enrollment because they recognize they're not very good at it. And there are a lot of reasons that enrollment has been hard with the low-income population. One is poor outreach, information, resources. They're not reaching low-income communities, especially when they're primarily being distributed either online or in English. There's a real digital divide as well. Enrollment in programs usually requires that applicants have access to internet or computers or smartphones, email, but many low-income, elderly immigrant tenants do not have access to these things, making it impossibly difficult for them to enroll in the program without a lot of support. So for example, Sage, we enroll tenants in the refrigerator exchange program currently, and there have been so many instances where Sage staff has actually had to create emails and passwords for tenants so they can enroll. And they've never before, had an email before, and they don't have any use for one. With the exception of needing to enroll in this program that's going to get them something. Language barriers as well. A lot of application materials are almost always in English. Sometimes they're in English and Spanish, and almost never in other languages. Even though we have a lot of different monolingual populations in LA. The rental lease itself also acts as a major barrier. On this slide, you'll see a common provision in a California rental lease that says tenants need to submit written requests from owners to make alterations, or otherwise it's a violation of the lease. For the same refrigerator exchange program, around 50% of the tenants we've tried to help enroll in this program, even though they really wanted to, they didn't because of this lease provision. They wanted the new energy efficient fridge, but they didn't want to risk violating their lease, and they didn't want to ask their landlord because the relationship was either fraught or they weren't comfortable doing that. So that's an important thing to consider when we think about how we design these programs. And landlord consent, which is related. A lot of these programs require that tenants ask their landlords for permission to be able to participate. Again, at Sage, we serve tenants who do have fraught relationships with their landlords, and even though they want to participate in these programs, if it means engaging with their landlord, they're often not going to do it. So just for one example, the home energy improvement program, if you're not an owner of the property, you have to obtain owner approval, or the AC optimization program. Multi-residential property tenants can't request the program services directly. They have to go through the property owner. So this is a big barrier. Rebate programs as well, they require residents to pay the upfront costs, and a lot of low-income tenants do not have the resources to pay for, new appliances or things up front. And so there's this really great program called the Cool LA AC Rebate Program. It'll give tenant or any residents up to a $225 rebate if they purchase an AC unit from the marketplace that LADWP has curated. But the cheapest AC unit is $150, and this is pretty much out of reach for a lot of very low-income people, even those who really need an AC unit. And then lastly, building quality is a big barrier as well. A lot of the tenants we serve live in buildings that suffer a range of habitability issues, from pest infestations to mold. And a lot of programs either do not set aside money to fix issues like asbestos when they're discovered, maybe during retrofits, or these types of buildings just aren't eligible outright to participate in available programs. So to kind of give you an idea of some of the conditions, we kind of give a trigger warning for this slide, but I forgot to say that this is a tenant we help. This is one of our tenant leaders at Sage in East Compton. Pictured here is her home that her landlord has refused to fix. Holes in her walls, broken windows, cockroaches, ants. She has a broken water heater, so she hasn't had hot water in years. And her landlord won't repair the home. The county doesn't have strong enough mechanisms to force the landlord to abide by the law. And so a tenant like this, who could really benefit from electrification, isn't going to see it as a priority when living in these kind of conditions. So, addressing all these issues, there are a lot of them. It's going to be challenging. It's going to require intentionality. And a point I really want to emphasize is that it's going to require more than just affordability requirements. Slapping on a do not raise the rent of the tenant, or you cannot evict the tenant for 5 years after you take advantage of this decarb, rebate program, or that's just not going to be enough. Sophisticated, bad acting landlords know how to get around things like that. And so I'm just going to share a few, sort of strategies and recommendations that could help solve some of these issues. So one is partnering with community-based organizations to do outreach, enrollment, and implementation of energy efficiency programs. The second is to target funding and programs to low-income customers in disadvantaged communities. Two, recognize the threats that tenants face and make robust tenant protections a design element of decarbonization. A really important one is learn the tenant landlord policies in your city and consult tenant advocates to learn what's happening on the ground. What is the situation like for tenants? And then design policy around that. Another is engaging local housing agencies. Work with them, emphasize their role in the implementation of decarbonization. These are the agencies that enforce tenant protections, or the ones that oversee pass-through costs or those kind of programs. It's important to engage them, whether you're working on a citywide policy or a program that applies to tenants in a city. Ban pass-through costs for rent-stabilized tenants and implement rent restrictions. And then actively manage the execution of decarbonization work to prioritize skilled professional work, high-quality results, and low impact to tenants. And then do direct install when possible. Minimize those harms that come from construction work. And then, I think for this to be really, to make decarbonization harm-proof is really what it's going to take is, passing foundational tenant protections, strong rent stabilization laws, right to counsel, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, and the continuation of eviction moratoria until the COVID-19 crisis is over. All right, I'll stop there. I realize that was a lot of information. Let me stop myself.
Woohoo! You did not disappoint. Whew. Okay, so the recommendations that you just went through, each one of them seemingly of similar weighting, but there was one that was like a ban on the pass-through costs, and I was hoping you expand on that and expand on who would pass the laws that are tenant protection. Like Katie Porter was here this morning as our keynote, right? Is it a federal thing that needs to get passed, or is this a state by state, or like how do we succeed at this?
Good question. Let's start with the first one. So the ban on the pass-through costs, basically, and this kind of applies mostly to, if a city is producing or working on like a building energy performance standard, and it's going to be a citywide policy that's mandated and maybe it's phased, ban the pass-through costs onto tenants so that they can't take advantage of existing, like, for example, the primary renovation work program to pass that cost onto tenants. So kind of to make that more clear, for example, in 2015, LA passed a seismic retrofit policy. And within that policy, they created a specific cost recovery program that was like way less than the existing cost recoveries, to where tenants could only get charged $50 a month or $38 a month, which is still a lot, but we're recommending no cost. There's a lot of renter precarity right now with COVID-19. We want to preserve the affordability of the rental housing stock. So that's what I was sort of referring to.
Is there a possibility of implementing these recommendations into the Inflation Reduction Act agency actions, because the tax credits, the rebates, all these are coming first through federal agencies and being defined and then coming down?
Yeah, I think I think in some of these specific types of programs that get created, like these rebate programs and otherwise, you can sort of create provisions in them that that costs will not be passed on to tenants. It's a matter of like, are you actually dedicating resources to enforcing those provisions? Are you working with the local housing agency in the jurisdictions where these programs are being used to make sure that that's actually happening? I mean, even just recently in LADWP program, they were like, yeah, we're like, they can't pass on the cost, or they can't evict for 10 years. I was like, okay, how's that being enforced? Where do tenants go and complain? And they're like, oh, we don't know how it's going to be enforced, or we haven't thought that through. Think that through and figure that out. Does that answer your question?
It does, except for the question of who do you think is the right actor right now? Is it the federal government? Is it the agencies that are implementing the IRA? Is it cities? Like, how do we succeed in implementing your strategies in a systematic way, given our current levers of power?
Yeah, I think with regard to, the need for these like foundational protections that kind of go beyond decarbonization, but are important.
Yeah.
It's going to be the state and the city. There hasn't been a lot of federal tenant policy. Definitely, if you're working on a city policy, the local city council and the mayor can pass these policies. And then at the state level, the state legislature can pass these policies.
Okay. So make sure getting to Ted, you like the question. Cool.
Not like it's going to be easy, but those are the identified political targets.
Well, can I ask then, you said that the federal government has not passed any legislation. Are you saying it cannot because it doesn't have jurisdiction because of separation of powers? Because you can imagine what kind of horrors happen in Mississippi, but also in California with solar policy. I could talk about a whole different thing, but this is a real problem. So is there a federal opportunity?
What I am saying, and in terms of the tenant piece, I don't think so politically. I don't think alignment across the board, and I don't think there's been a lot of advocacy efforts for that. So tenant advocates are like mostly focused on like local and state targets. It just seems like it seems politically impossible at this time. Maybe that'll change, but historically, like they've never really been the main target. It's been state and city or county.
Okay, well, I mean, the reason we're having this conference is to try to shift political power. So I'm like, yeah. Okay, so it could be done at the federal level. It's not being done. It could hypothetically be built into agency actions over the next 10 years as the IRA continues to be enforced. If we made comments, that could happen. I
don't know. I actually don't know.
Okay. And yeah. Your organization is not yet participating at the federal level in making comments.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. Every state has a different set of renter laws, basically. Some states outright ban rent stabilization and rent control. In California, strong rent control is banned, rent stabilization is not. And so that's sort of why the state would be a target, and then within the city.
Okay, I appreciate that. Well, is there anything else that you want to share before we went to next presenter?
Oh, already out of time. No, I think I shared so much today already. What I will say is if anyone would like to sort of talk more or have me elaborate on some of the things I brought up today, please feel free to reach out to me. I put my email on the presentation, but I will also put it in the chat. And thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was brilliant. That was exhaustively detailed. That was just as nerdy as we could all hope for. And I feel like I want to watch it a couple times and then hang out with you to strategize. How do we? So thank you so much, Chelsea.